All right, so let's hop to color now that we have a good base. So I've just been having this for now, right? Where we have a base color and some AO just multiplied over it and a curvature. This is just something I do often to be able to see the height a little bit better as I'm working on it. Plus AO textures are always fun to look at. But let's pull our reference over. And we're going for this kind of green stone. This one's a bit more zoomed out. I can't see detail as well. It's important to have good reference. But this gives me an idea of the different sort of color swatches available to me. This, however, has a lot more close-up detail, so I can see stuff a lot better. Different types of details. So we're going to work exact same principles as the height map, working up from the big details all the way to the small. There's some cool stuff you can do to extract colors from this. You can use the gradient map and the color picker and stuff like that for sure. Something we can do is I'm just going to use my snipping tool to save just this image. And I'm going to put this out in the folder where we have this graph saved. I'll just call this substance resources. And I'm going to pull this image directly into substance. Call this albedo capture. This is kind of a neat trick you can do. And there's, like I said, there's a million ways you can do this. There's no real wrong way. We will go to the 5 levels, pull that in. We can just draw a color directly from this, which is kind of interesting. So we don't really want to grab the grout in particular. So we can try to pass that out. And a way to do that is to look through the different channels and see where, so I'm just hitting on my keyboard R. You can see it flipping down here in the 2D viewport, R, G, B, A, as I'm just looking through the different channels, and I'm trying to find where it's most distinct. It seems like it's the most distinct in the red. So what you could do is take an RGBA split. I'm just trying to isolate the grout. I'm going to see if I can do it using just a histogram scan here. I should be able to get pretty close. Grab a little bit of the tile, but that's okay. And what you can do now is use a distance, plug the original into the distance, and that into the color, and we can try to close up that gap. And obviously the more we expand this, the more of that closing we'll get. But you can see that does a good job of taking that grout out, and will make it just not pickable really as a color, because we're going to feed this into a gradient dynamic. So this can help. It's worth trying for sure. I don't mind this as a start. Another thing you could do, if you didn't want to isolate the color that way, is you could use a material selector. So this just makes a mask of the color you pick. So with the bitmap selected, I can go to the material selector and try to color drop pick just this grout color. And that can work similarly. Right, so this could have also worked. We would need to invert that mask. We need the grout to be black. Right, so they both do a similar job. I actually think this one does better, the channel shuffle here. And you can make adjustments to that further, but I think this works fairly well. Just to grab a bunch of base color. You can then blur this, which we likely will do actually, and we can do all sorts of color correction to it as well. So what we're going to do is blur, and in fact, I might actually want to go for more of this blue color potentially. They're very similar tiles, but I don't know if I maybe like the color of this one better. Let's try this one as well. So I'm just going to do the same thing, snip this one. We have lots of flex, then again, and really good thing about Designer, right, is we have a ton of flexibility to change our plan as we go. And it's really quick to swap it if we need to. So I'm going to grab, I can name this one Albedo Capture 02, just off screen there. Bring that one in. And we probably would need a slightly different setup for drawing that color out. I kind of like this color a bit more, but we'll see how we feel. So we're going to need a similar setup, right? Because this doesn't really work as well, because the grout's a different. Oh, you know, the grout actually isn't that different here. Let's look through here. Red, green. Let's look through our different channels. Red, green, blue. It's actually sort of, I think, more easy to pull apart in green. Yeah, I think that works pretty well. So we can try with both, but let's try with the blue first. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're just going to focus on texturing all the stones. We're going to ignore the breaks. We'll put in something quick for the grout, but very similar to what we were doing with the cracks. I find it easier just to texture the whole thing and then blend over the parts we need as we need them. I think that's just simpler. So I'm going to start by just blurring this completely to full, basically getting an average color. We're going to do a lot of color picking off of the actual reference later as well, or just eyeballing it too. So I'm just getting a base color, basically. So this is just, if you blur this at a very high number, you're essentially just averaging all the, well, you aren't essentially, you are averaging the colors. So this gives you sort of a representation of what colors are there. And we can make adjustments to this here if we wanted to. After this, like if you wanted to bump up the saturation and stuff, and we'll do some of that later. But this is okay for now. We want to get all of these tiles a slightly different tint. And a nice way to do that, this is sort of why we made this setup, is we can get a dot, grab our flood fills from our tiles, grab our flood fill mask as well, make a flood fill to random grayscale. And I think we may want multiple random grayscales later. So making a random color, a patron pointed this out. This can actually be nice because we'll just get, I've been trying to avoid doing this just because it seems like it's a bit more complex, but I think everyone can handle it, as evidenced by the Patreon comment. So we can distance this like we've been doing with all of our flood fills. And then if we look through the different channels of this texture, we have just we have 3, and 4 including the alpha, random grayscale textures in here. So we could just use an RGBA split, and now we have 4 for like the space of 1, really. It's not that much less expensive. Like these nodes are really cheap, but maybe you like prefer to have it just come from one location, potentially. So we're gonna need a lot more room, so we're just gonna move a bunch of this down. We need a ton of room on the albedo here. So what we can do here is take a gradient dynamic. So here you just plug in a grayscale input, and then you plug in a gradient. And it's just going to sample. It's going to use these these grayscale values to sample the texture. And all it's doing is grabbing the horizontal line here. You can see on the gradient dynamic, it's sampling a horizontal line of pixels, and the input position is position 1. Right? So it's just grabbing all of this. Right? This entire first top line of pixels is being sampled and remapped to this grayscale. Now, the issue with this is you're not really going to be able to grab values that happen later down in the texture. It's only, imagine grabbing just that first row of pixels. You can move where that position is. Right? You see you get a lot of different colors in here. So a way you can kind of scatter this more is instead we're going to use a flood fill to position. So we haven't used this yet, but this just gives us a position of where each of our tiles are on the UV sheet. So the dark ones up here, right? These are their positions horizontally in the red channel. The green channel is their positions vertically in the V, right? In the green channel. And what we can use is use these instead to sample basically whatever pixel on this texture is underneath the middle of that tile, it will grab. So this will be able to sample sort of more. It'll make better use of the texture. To sample this, we actually have to use a pixel processor. You've never used these, don't be too worried about it. This is like a fairly simple, it's actually a nice way to get into using them. So we just plug this guy in, and all you have to do, you can see we get a new input. And we're going to also plug our color into input 1. So we have our positions in input 0 and our color in input 1. If you go to the pixel processor and edit, you see we enter the function graph for just that pixel processor. And what we're going to do is type get float2. You'll see in here all the nodes are very different. It's because this is basically writing shader code almost. Really, sort of, you're doing like a pixel shader, I guess. Or you're working with shader logic. So it's all math and stuff like that. There's also no output. Right? It's giving you this yellow text that says no output defined. We'll need to, and it's telling you what it's expecting, either a float or a float4. So we're going to get a float2, and up here in the dropdown, all these $sign floats are system variables. So they're accessible in anything, right? We didn't build these. They come with Designer, and they're accessible globally in all the functions. We're going to go to position, and then sample a color texture. And we're going to sample input 0, which is already selected by default. And that's our position, right? So if I right click on the graph and hit set as output node, you see it goes orange. And this is what this pixel processor is currently doing, right? All it's doing is taking image input 0 and sampling it. So it's just displaying it. That's really, there's no difference between this and this, right? These are the same thing. But what we can do is use the UV coordinates of these to sample input 2. So image input 1 is our second input, where it's our color texture. So we're going to basically use these as UVs to sample this. Now we can't plug these right in because they're not the same data type. This is a float4, right? RGBA. We only need RNG, the first two, to sample this. So you can do a swizzle float 2 or swizzle float 4. You can even just do swizzle float. Grab just the X and Y. We should be able to grab both at once. So this grabs just the red and green. If we were to it won't let us output this because it wants a float or float 4. But this is grabbing just the RNG or the X and Y components of this. And we can definitely plug that in here. And then we get this. So it's a subtle difference. This will generally make better use of the entire texture sheet because it's not just sampling that top horizontal line of pixels, that first row. Wherever they are, these tiles are on the sheet, they'll just sample the pixel that's directly under the middle of them. So it just, I like this because it just gives you more variety out of that texture you're sampling. And I'm just going to blend these with our kind of base color. You can also see, yeah, I don't think that's that bad already. You can see these textures here are all 1K. That's probably okay because we're just using solid colors right now. There's no variety. But once we start adding in higher frequency detail, we'll want to hop up to 4K like the rest of our graph. But I think this is a pretty good job of just representing where we're at pretty quickly. Like we get a lot out of that really early on, which is nice. And I think the color variation is nice. We may want to tone it down a little. That's why we have the control on the opacity here. Maybe we think it's too strong. We can make it a bit more subtle. And I think that's nice. At this point, like we're going to obviously do a ton more work on the albedo, but I do think it makes sense to mask out our grout and our like exposed broken grout first, right? Just so that we can look at that in a bit. It looks a bit nicer right away. So it looks like the grout on these is this fairly dark color, but they can be bright. And I kind of like the look of going bright grout in opposition to these colors, but we can always play with it. So the question is, how do we get the grout first? So this is where the grout gets laid on top, right? Whenever you're trying to do an extraction there, we've done lots of this on the channel. You're really just looking at the difference between this and what came before it, right? The thing that's different in the end result here, if we take this, and if we take, I'm just going to hold control to duplicate this and set this to subtract. This is just the difference between those two textures. It's the difference between this texture and this texture. And the difference of that is our grout. We can histogram scan this. And then we have a perfect mask for our grout. Right, so this is a really simple thing. Right, because we made an adjustment here by blending these two things together. All we need to do is get the final result and subtract what came before it, and then we get the difference, like where they were different. Right, a good way to think about subtraction is it is a difference, right? If you take 5 and you subtract 2 from it, the difference is 3. So we're able to do that same thing here to get to pull out masks from stuff we did earlier on, which is a really like invaluable part of doing layer blending. So I'm gonna make a portal node here and we'll call this our grout mask. And before we put on all of our AO and stuff, I'm gonna use that mask to lay on some grout. So grab our dot, grab our grout mask. Oh, it's always nice how well this works right away. And we'll just pick a uniform color for our grout at first. And like I said, I do want to try making like a fairly bright grout. So I'm picking like a warm color just to contrast it with the cool colors we've picked. Adding a little bit of saturation and making it quite bright. I think that's kind of neat. Right, it makes a big difference right away. And we don't necessarily need to stick with the bright. Maybe at the end of the day, we decide to go darker. I'm not sure yet. But you can see how effective this is at right away pulling the tiles off from their grout. Right, it's really, really simple. It does a great job. Like there's no seam. It blends exactly where it's supposed to. Right, so setting up that math correctly and those mask extractions is really worth it. So we will definitely do a ton of work on this. But let's go back to the albedo of the actual tiles for now. So there's a lot we can do here. Right, there's a ton of different types of noise here that we can work on. I like these little cracks. We're going to try to get something like that. But for the most part, we're looking at just like, it's more easily seen on this. Like, it's just a bunch of noise for the most part. And with stone, that's not entirely uncommon because they have all sorts of different, you know, the contents of different blends and different types of minerals involved. And you get like this natural kind of look. So it's really just finding noises that look like this and layering them on top. So the moisture noise is really good at doing rock noise like this. We're going to make some variations to this. We should actually, we don't need this line here now. We can make a portal final height. Right, just so we get rid of this. There you go. Get out of here. So I'm going to actually grab our height map and see what happens when we just directionally warp this with our height map. This is just to separate the noise a bit. Right, and it creates these nice kind of marbly patterns. Right, because it's warping it more or less depending on the values of the height map. So this is not a bad way to just spread that initial noise out. And we can do an auto level here just to make sure we have black and white, which looks like we already did, but just to be sure. So this is actually not that bad for just an initial noise. I'm going to grab this moisture again and make a vector because I want to subtract from this just so that it's not so perfect. Right, so we can break it up a bit more. We may even do a high pass on this to get some higher frequencies. As you can see the high pass, you did it before, but it takes away all of the big shapes, right? You can see these big dark shapes, big white shapes here. The lower this number is, the more you get rid of those and you focus on just the high frequencies. A good way to visualize it working is if you plug in a levels Or better yet, let's just look at the histogram scan. You can see there's these kind of big lumps in the histogram. But if we use the high pass, we smooth it out, essentially. Right? You can see this is fairly lumpy with these big lumps. If we get this down quite a bit, and we'll put an auto level here, we're going to have less kind of big bumps and more of a spike because we're focusing on just the high frequencies. And I'm going to subtract from here. And I may even histogram scan this. The auto leveled high pass there in order to just get, I'm looking for some really like splotchy noise essentially. This might be a little too zoomed out, so I'll turn the high pass up a little. I'm just using this to break this up a bit more. Yeah, something like that. I think that works. So here's a nice kind of like initial noise. And I'm just going to run this through, this time, a gradient dynamic. And use that same color input. We kind of want to look through the texture a bit. We can't do the same trick we did with the position on this one. Like something like this is kind of neat. We can't do the same position trick here because you can't really make a position map out of these. What you can attempt it by using an edge detect. Probably gonna be impossible with something this noisy. You could try, it's worth it to see if we can try it. It's gonna be really tough. Right, I'm trying to do the same trick we were doing with the stone, where I make a curvature and try to isolate some islands here. I think it'll be really tough though. Let's just see what this looks like. Yeah, like this, I mean, it looks really cool. I don't think it's gonna work terribly well though. We could try it. We're gonna get these kind of striations. So let's give it a shot. We'll do flood filter position. This makes sense. And then we could duplicate this pixel processor and just swap out this position mask for this one. We're gonna want a distance too. Right, so we plug in the distance. This should be, you know, doesn't really bear repeating, but we're just gonna hear about that a ton. I'm always doing the distance to close those flood fills. I mean, this actually doesn't look that bad. I kind of like the look of it, actually. Depending on what you're after, it's definitely simplified the noise quite a bit. That might be okay. We might want to break this up again. It also has the problem that it ends up grabbing the grout more, which isn't great. Like we can kind of see, it's such a fine detail that we're basically just pixelating. It's almost applying like a paint effect to this texture. We can probably make that a bit better by blurring the input color. Make it a little better, but it's still gonna be pretty tough to not see those. So that's sort of the problem with doing this. And we can't really blend this on very well. Right, because we're going to see that other image is kind of like overlaid over top of it, which isn't great. It actually perfectly lines up that we have 4 of our tiles for every 1 of the new tile. So this doesn't work excellently, but that's just going to be tricky to manage with this. It's just because of how highly frequent these noises are, that we're basically just duplicating the image we're sampling. It is cool, and maybe we could do something like this later on if we want to add this kind of scratchy detail to our albedo, but for now it doesn't work that great. So we'll save this stuff because maybe we'll do something like it later to add that kind of effect down the road. But what we're going to do for now to just start getting our color is just use a normal gradient dynamic. The other thing we can do here is, if we want to get rid of some of this noise, quantize this. So this just steps it. So instead of having just like really fine changes between layers, this creates steps, which this tends to work better in a gradient dynamic. Oops, we want that as a grayscale input. We'll grab our color. And that's kind of nice. It's not that bad. The issue is we're not going to be able to scan that whole texture, right? But we can find what we do like. We can put multiple of these in. And we can even blend between them. So we can do stuff like find a spot we like. Something like this. Duplicate it. Grab a different version. That's sort of a different area of the color. We can also switch the orientation to vertical so it looks vertically through the texture. So these are quite different. And we can do stuff like just blend between these with maybe another moisture noise. So we're just getting a combination of these two. And let's just blend these on top. You may even want to try like a soft light. So this just gets some initial big color variations on the tiles. And it's pretty subtle. But I think it does a pretty good job of just getting that like first bit of breakup on. And we can kind of duplicate this again if we want to make another version of this. So I'm just going to duplicate this section here. And we're going to grab kind of a different part, looking for a different group of colors if possible. Like over here maybe. So just trying to make these different. And what we can do too is grab a different version of this noise as well. So what we can do is duplicate this chain and change the warp direction so that this noise is different from this one. And use this one to control the second. So these have a completely different grayscale input as well. And we don't really need to pay for both moisture noises here. We can just take that first one and rotate it, move it out of the way. Same trick we've been doing. Like that. And we can blend this one over top as well. Another fun thing you can do is get a perfect combination of these two. Right, a fun way you can work on the blending here. You can just take a pixel processor. We're going to sample both of these colors. Right, so I'm going to get a float 2, and we're going to sample a color. So I'm going to grab the position. Grab 2 sample color nodes, one for input 0, one for input 1. And I'm going to just add these together. And then I'm going to divide it by the total number of inputs, right? So we're going to get an average of both, right? If you add 3 and 7, and you get 10, and then you divide it by 2, you get 5. So you're getting like the set point between the two of them. To divide this, we actually need a vector float 4, or sorry, a float 4. Because we need to divide all channels equally, except for alpha. So we need this. Right, so the red, green, and blue channels will all be divided by 2, because we've added 2 inputs together. But we'll leave alpha alone. So this creates a more expected blend between these two textures. Now we're not doing any channel weighting or there's kind of advanced stuff there you could do, but I think this works really nice. It gets you a ton of different variety. So let's blend this on. We could also blend them onto the base like this as well. Like right now we're using a blend node. But we could instead use our fun pixel processor here to blend this with the base. Right? And get a more half of each. But I think I'm okay using the soft light blend to blend them on top. I'm liking the result of the kind of subtlety of it. And again, this just gets our basic breakup noise on top of it. I want to see an overlay. Might be a little too strong. Overlay feels nice. Cool. So this type of stuff, like it looks complex, right, when you see it, but it's really not that bad. And it's a fairly, it's really just like using these kind of tricks to build up the complexity gradually, right? Which is, I mean, it's no different from what we were doing in the height map, really. So let's organize this a bit. And we might do that whole process again. We might duplicate this whole chain and do that one more time, maybe with a different noise even. And we're laying this stuff all on pretty evenly, but we can play around with using a texture to break up how it's added. Right? So if we use this black and white spots, for instance, as a mask, the blend is going to be much stronger in some areas than others, which adds a lot of variety. Right? And it just gives us, like, you could, basically, it's very rare you're going to see in the albedo me have an empty mask slot like this. It does happen for sure. Like, sometimes you just need it because that's what you're trying to build. But having it there definitely adds a bit more flavor, right? Because if we delete this, you can kind of tell that this was just like pasted over top. But if you put this here, we get a bit more of a breakup. And this noise is very similar to the rest of the kind of general feel of the noise we get here. So as a result, they kind of marry up nicely, right? It feels even more stony, basically. But I think this works well. It's looking nice. And we're going to go do similar stuff to the grout later and all that, but I think this works for now. Like these stones, I think, are feeling quite nice. Nice. Cool. I'm going to basically duplicate this whole chain, and you could make subgraphs from this if you want to, but I'm going to keep them out in the open just for the sake of not having to jump back between a bunch of graphs during the tutorial. But this is absolutely something that you could make into a new graph, right? And seed it and do all that fun stuff so you can make really quick variation. But for now, let's just duplicate it. I don't want to make that like super complicated, or do I? We could, but let's keep them out here just in the open for now. That's nice and legible. If it were my own graph, I would likely go and put these into subgraphs. But for now, let's not do that. Also, these guys are going to start stretching absolutely everywhere. So I'm going to make a portal node for him and call him sampled color 01. And we'll put that dot node here. Again, just to keep the graph clean. Sampled color. We can swap these all out. This will look way nicer. Nothing changes. But this kind of becomes its own module. We don't have to send that noise just absolutely everywhere. I'm going to duplicate this whole section. And we're going to do that again, but we're going to grab a different noise. So instead of the moisture noise, let's grab something like, I want to grab something even finer. So like maybe a black and white spots. And it's just going to filter through. And we're going to get a similar result, just a noisier one. And we can also, if we want this to sample different, like this gradient dynamic and this one are sampling the same part of the color. What we could do is just put a transform here to move it slightly. Right, so I'm just holding shift to redirect them from here to here. Like shift and then I'll show you it again. I want it to go into here, so I'm shift dragging from here to there to reroute them all. But I'm just going to move this slightly, and as a result, all these samples will slide around, right? You can see me move it, and they slide, and we get different variety. And this is just more of a higher frequency noise. And I'm just going to scroll around until I find one I really like. Looking for a bit of variety in here. It's really high frequency noise. I think that works okay. And I might want to put a level on here. And I'm going to make this way more intense. Basically doing the equivalent of an auto level. This is very, very frequent noise. So we'll take this, and I'm going to soft light or overlay it again, one of the two. And this is just to get even more like very high frequent noise into it. Yeah, I think that works well. Also, I'm realizing we're still at 1K, right? See, we're doing all this work at 4K, but it's getting downsized. It's looking a little blurry. It's just because I forgot. The reason why it's 1K in the first place is because this image was. So all of these are inheriting 1K from him. So all we really need to do is on this node, let's set our output or our output size relative to parent, which is 4K. And now this looks a lot sharper. Right, it's a good thing we caught that now. And I think this looks really nice. I think it's a little consistent. We basically, because this noise is very similar, kind of everywhere, we're kind of putting like a universal sheen on everything. Right, like everything is getting this kind of breakup on top of it that looks very similar on every tile. So we can break that up. We'll grab a dot and grab our flood fill and go flood fill to random grayscale and grab a distance. And we're going to need our flood fill mask as well. Right, so this is the same thing we've been pulling from like basically the entire tutorial. And we'll take a histogram scan here. We may not even need to, but we're probably going to actually use a histogram range potentially. But the idea is if we use this, that noise, you can see it got much weaker on this tone. It's just not uniformly on them all at the same intensity, basically. Which it does make a difference. It's a little subtle if we zoom out. Right? That's the same strength everywhere. This just modulates it a bit, which I think helps. We can also break this mask up even more with some sort of noise. Like we could actually even just take that moisture noise from earlier and just subtract this or add sub it just to add even more breakup. Right, so it's a little hard to see the effect of it, but a lot of good texturing is subtleties like that. You can definitely notice it when it's on. It also just adds more noise. Because this is so speckly, we could even grab a different noise. If we black and white spots is good for this. We may even zoom it out a bit. Right, then we're adding a lot more noise. Because it's very much either there or not. And on some tiles, it's very minimally there. Like on this one, it's basically not there at all. But on the ones next to it, it's on quite a bit, but at least it's on in a very noisy way. And I think we could do this whole thing one more time as well. And again, you know, having a separate subgraph for these would be nice. It takes up a bit less space in here. And we can seed them and just change the inputs, but maybe we'll do that for like a bonus patrons only thing. We'll take these guys and turn them into their own subgraph. That might be a nice idea for a separate content. But we're gonna do the same thing here. where we just seed this noise. Right, we move this guy around a bit. Maybe seed the moisture noise here as well. And I'm just trying to get a different version of this. Right now, this one's a bit yellow. So I'm just going to move our sampled color around a bit. It's a little blue too, but we can just ease back on the level here. And we'll do the same thing. Grab a random grayscale. Seed this noise. We just get a different one again. And we've just added another layer to this. So you can see that over time, we're just building up this really kind of subtle, nice textural quality here. If you ever want to bump these up too, another thing you can do is make a grayscale conversion of this and auto level it. And I'm just going to make a gradient map of this. This is just to turn the grayscale into color. And I'm going to blend this over top with just like an add sub. So this is going to make the noise a lot more obvious. Right? So we obviously wouldn't want it like this. This is going to look like crap. But we can zoom that down quite a bit. And this just makes the noise a bit more obvious because we're boosting the black and white levels of it. For stuff like stone, this stuff can work really, really well. And we can do that pretty subtly and use the same mask. I think that looks, this is a really nice sort of like base layer for these stones. We're getting a ton of variety. And it's nice and subtle. I also think it's more obvious when we have this on really high. I'm not crazy about how we're getting these kind of sways here. And that's literally just because we're directionally warping these with the height map. And the height map really is mostly just gradients. So I would be interested to see what this would look like if we take a moisture noise or a cloud or something, maybe a bit of both, and add that to the warp. Just so we have a bit more of a breakup. Right, so what happens if we like add sub this from our height map first before we do the warps? Right, these become a lot more interesting. Or you can see if we have just the height map, it's very straight because the tile height map is mostly just a slope. It's just a gradient. But if we add a little bit of this noise, it breaks them up even more. And the resulting textures become a lot nicer. So we would want to replace all these with that too. We could make a portal node of this, or we could just drag them. Right, I think this is ultimately going to be a better look. We get a lot more variety. Yeah, I like that better. And I'm going to turn that opacity on that down just a bit. And I think these are looking nice. It really is just like I've mentioned, you know, many times before. A lot of the texturing workflow at this point is just making adjustments in different parts of the graph. Right, just tuning stuff. And generally, the less things you have to tune, the better. Or at least you want few things to tune that all are very high impact. Oh, we forgot. We didn't even include this one. Cool. We almost missed out on a bunch there. And I think we're going to do something similar with the blends here. Right here where we actually added that grayscale version as well. Right, so we need a grayscale conversion, auto level it. We made a gradient map. And we just add sub this on this blend as well, just to get a bit more luminance variation. And we'll use the same mask. And in fact, instead of doing it in these two blends, because they're the same mask, we could just blend this with that first and switch this to our overlay like that. This just allows us to, we don't need to do those two blends in one location, essentially. Right. So in case you missed that, I'll see it here. What I didn't like is that we're basically blending on our color first and then our luminance after. But these blends are essentially identical, right? With the same mask. So I was just saying, why don't we just blend these together first? Right? Our little add sub. Put this up a little bit. And then we just blend this entire thing over top of what came before it with our mask. It just saved, it's a bit cleaner. Basically. We'll plug in the rest of our blends. Yeah, and we're getting some real nice detail on these. And just, I've been looking at my reference, right? But I think we're in the right spot for sure. We still have a lot more to go, and we can make global adjustments to this really easily if we want to. I'll show you what I mean. I think we want to do the same. We can tune, these are maybe a little strong. We can tune them down a bit. Cool. If you ever want to make global adjustments to this, it's pretty easy to do if we're working on a setup like this. And this works on different types of materials, the setup we're doing with the sampling, especially if you're trying to copy a piece of reference really closely. Stone, it's very good at, just because it tends to be good at this kind of thing. We don't really need, we didn't actually end up using this. Get rid of that. What's cool is you can do all sorts of changes to the color before it hits all these three things. And it will really change the result of the whole texture. So, for instance, if we decided we want this to be more green, right? We just have a level here. We go to the green channel and we boost it up. The whole thing becomes more green because the color that we're sampling has just become more green. So you can make all sorts of really, again, this is, you know, back to what I was saying earlier about the, you want to have very few, but very impactful sliders to move. Because a ton of the time you're going to spend in Designer, particularly, well, I was going to say particularly in Albedo, but I think it's true of all of them, really. Albedo, height, roughness. You're going to spend a lot of time making adjustments and balancing stuff. And you really want there to be few sliders to move that do very strong things, right? That have a very big impact on the final result. So it's nice to have, I just want to make it a bit more green. Cool. Boost up the green levels a bit. Or if you want to make everything more saturated, pump up the saturation. Right? So there's a lot you can do with this. But having like a few things that do a lot of work is really, really helpful. Cool. These are all looking really nice. I think that's good for the stone for now. We're going to add some more details, but let's focus on this AO for a second. Because right as it is right now, we're just multiplying some black AO on everything, which isn't really great because we're missing an opportunity to do a lot of color. I think it'd be nicer to have some sort of like kind of brown color, like to be more of a grunge, right? And instead we'll use our AO as a mask. So we just invert this. I think this is nicer. It's a lot less severe. Right, so I call these things at the end kind of like the finishers, where you're going to add some, maybe a bit of curvature. But this feels a lot more like soft and more natural, We don't have that harsh black from the AO on top of it. We can make our grunge a bit darker, maybe a bit more saturated. You can play with this. Right, so this is obviously too intense. Well, maybe not obviously. Maybe some people like this, but I think it's too intense. So I'm gonna brighten it up a bit. And it's nice to pick this brown that sort of contrasts with the green, like the overall green look of the tile. This AO is probably spreading just a little too much. So I'm going to turn the radius down so it stays more tight to the cracks. We also turn the quality up. Yeah, it doesn't need to be so everywhere. I want it to be mostly in the cracks. Yeah, something like that. Maybe make it a little bit darker. Cool. I think this is already a really good start, I think. And this is one of those things we'll have to stop at some point because like I could just go forever on it. But this is okay for now. We're going to obviously make a bit more detail in this grout. I actually like the white grout. It's going to get darkened by the AO anyway. And I think it is a nice contrast with everything else. It's actually kind of wound up at a similar tone to what we have in the reference. Like these actually got quite similar. So that might actually be what it is. That the grout is in the real world. The grout is fairly pale, like plain white. And then as it's just aging, right? And there's just all this grime and water and moisture collecting under here, it gets more brown, which is kind of what we ended up doing by accident, right? That would kind of make sense. Makes sense to me. So this stuff works nice. I'm also going to turn my roughness, make it a bit smoother for a sec, just so we have a bit more shine. And we still have to do all of our roughness maps as well. And it's also probably the case that I'm going to come down and like chill these colors out a little bit because right now they're quite strong. And that's a preference thing. I think I usually make things really, really colorful just because I tend to like it. But something I'm trying to practice is making things a bit more subtle and not being super like too colorful all over the place, basically. But I think these do look quite nice. We get a lot of nice variety in here. So I'm gonna, if to get less color variation in here, for one thing, I might just turn the saturation down a bit. I think I got a little carried away. It's a bit better. If you also feel like there's too much color variation, blurring this whole texture will cut down on it, right? The more you blur the sampled texture, the less variety you'll have. So that can be a nice way to also control the total, because as we blur this, these colors become more similar, right? Same thing with all of the samples downstream here. The more we blur this texture that's being sampled, the more similar they all become, right? And ultimately, eventually, they would all become the same color, right? There's barely any variation. So again, a really impactful slider right? To just tune how much variety there is globally, right? The entire graph changes. And you can mix and match these. Like if I don't mind the noise, like the amount of variety that's happening later in the graph, but I want this to have less variety, I can just go and tune that. Like maybe I think on this, the tiles are too too much of a rainbow. There's too many colors. I can just cut them down here and tune that kind of per tile color variation. Cool. So now I think this is good for now, but let's add some like specific, this was all just sort of creating like general noise on the albedo texture, like just some generic interest really. What we're going to do next is look at some like specific details we can see. By the way, we'll do this guy later, but I think this will be fun to try later on. We can, well, in fact, let's just give this a shot right now. This was our position map that didn't work very well. Right, so we had grabbed a normal of one of these noises, our height map. Right. Well, we had actually grabbed one of these. This is when we did that kind of, it ended up looking like a paint effect, sort of. Let's grab one of the moisture noise ones. So it was one of these. We made a normal map, made a curvature from it, did a histogram scan to try to grab those islands. And we made a flood fill out of these. And then we did our distance. And the color we sample, let's sample this color now that we're done. Now you can see we're sort of just making a kind of painterly version almost of our actual base color. So depending on, like, you can see right here, we can just swap this and everything becomes a lot more kind of painty. It's also getting darker, which is interesting. Oh, it's because we're just copying it with black here. There you go. Right, so you can see the difference between these two. One, it's got a lot more noise to it. The other one, the noise is a lot more simplified. So if you're trying to make something a bit more stylized or simplified, like if part of the stylization you're going for is a simplified color, something like this can work nice. We have more steps instead of more noise. We can also blend between the two, right? If we want a bit of both. Which I think can also be valuable. And we can even make a noise here so that this is uneven. Like I'll take another black and white one or something. So we'll have some areas where we can see a bit of that bigger, more simplified noise. Like here, right? We can see it behind everything very subtly. That can just add some variety to the level of detail, which we can see in the reference. Like again, the whole time we're working, I'm looking over at my reference here in the other monitor. But we can see that in places where we get a big dark spot here and then a small dark spot that's more noisy. So looking for that kind of thing can really help add more variety. So I think actually pushing in a bit of that is nice. And I'm going to zoom this guy out so the noise is a bit more frequent. But yeah, I think that looks nice. But let's find some individual stuff here. First of all, there's sort of this like general grunge that happens on them. That's not it's not really detected in the gradient maps, right? It's sort of this splotchy grunge look. So I think we should go after that. So let's treat all of this as sort of our base albedo. Right, so we'll grab all of this stuff. Oops. Wrong node. We'll frame this. We'll call this base albedo, or albedo base. Libido, albedo base. I'm going to get it right. I like to pick a bit of a color version for this. And then here's our color samples. So you can see, like, you know, you zoom out from this graph, like, you know, parenthetically, you zoom out from this and people will look at this and go, yeah, it's really complicated. But if you've watched this tutorial from the beginning, and like, bless you if you have, because it's very long, but you can see that it's actually not that complicated, right? One thing I want to try to stress as we're working on these things together is that this stuff looks a lot more complex than it is. Like if you just go through it, it's actually very simple. There's not a lot going on. A lot of these nodes are sort of just very repetitious, right? It's like there's transforms and blends, and there's not a lot of really unique things going on in here that you need to understand, right? There's not a lot of tricks. There's very few tricks actually, but then a lot of it is just stapled onto each other to create complexity slowly. Happy with this? Let's do that kind of generic grunge that's on everything. So moisture noise is a great place to start here. Probably going to zoom it out a bit. And I'm going to grab our height map actually. And we can do this fun thing here where we make the grunge more likely to happen in the crevices. So I'm going to make a curvature smooth here. And grab the curvature here. I'm going to auto level it. And I'm going to add sub these against each other. Invert this a bit. Right, so the grunge is going to get whiter. And we can invert the curvature here too, because we want the grunge to be stronger, closer to the crack. Right? So we get a lot more white closer to the cracks or the edges of the tiles than we do in the centers. And we can scan this to make it way more intense. Right, so we scan our curvature. We can get it to happen. We can be way more selective about where it happens. So this is sort of the amount of grunge, and then this is the pull back on it, like the contrast. We sort of just made a smart filter here, right? If you're in Painter or using like the metal edgeware or something in here, it really is just stuff like this, using some sort of derivative texture, so like curvature, AO, world space, position, whatever, and then manipulating it with some sort of texture to create a fun mask. I think we can also weight the curvature less by pulling back on this a bit. We could also have a histogram scan on the moisture noise, so it's a bit more off or on. Oops. Did that wrong. It's here. Right, so we're just creating this just kind of general grunge. Because we're capping this out at white in a bunch of places, the other thing you can do is I'm going to blend that curvature back on, or the moisture noise rather, back on at a bit of a lower opacity. And so I'll just subtract this. It's just to break it up so we don't get perfect white here. I might even invert this and multiply it so it's a bit less strong. Just to get some more breakup there. And then auto level this. And this is not a bad kind of just general mask here to put some of that grunge on. And the grunge, if we pull from the reference, it's just kind of this dark, kind of brown, gunky color. So I'm just going to, off on my other monitor, pick that color. It's actually very, very close to the grunge we were heading here. So we'll do this. And this just puts on that grunge. You get stuff like this, which is really cool. We probably want this to be more green and a bit darker, a bit more saturated. And I'm going to scale this moisture noise out even more. And I don't think weight the curvature as much. It's just a bit of a playing around, adjusting this mask. just playing around with it, trying to get the exact look we're going for. Yeah. I think this is just too diffuse. So bringing up the position. There we go. Kind of want harsher transitions between it. Right. Like stuff like this is really nice. So a lot of texturing is doing stuff like this. Just creating these masks from, like I said, derivatives, right? So AO, curvature, blending them in. I'm going to use less intensity. We want this to be fairly subtle. It is an old floor, so I imagine it's going to be quite dirty, but it's also possible that we want to put this grunge on after the grout. Although I think the AO on top of the grout is doing a pretty good job anyway. So that's a fun detail. Right, and it adds a ton. It's very different, right, if you turn it off. It's a lot dirtier. But it's a nice detail, and you can change that as much as you want. You can also scan this itself if you'd like to make this less diffuse, like less spread out. If you want it to be really kind of on or off. Right now it's a lot more either there or not, instead of kind of wishy-washy. And you can play with that. But this adds a lot of really nice texture. Cool. I like that. And I think we're getting pretty close. Like there's definitely some more we could do here, particularly around making some of these kind of darker specks. But I think we're getting awfully close. I think I'm going to push that color even a bit more red even. Yeah, I like that better. That's a nice. That's subtle, right? But I like that contrasting red. Might be a little too saturated, but cool. And we can also, complicate this a bit further by making this grunge itself a bit more interesting, like get some color variation in it. So I could just grab even something like the moisture noise we have
for
here,
now, I think it's fine if we just have this kind of simple
and do a
version of
gradient
it.
map.
We could make,
And just like,
you can do
simple
simple
stuff
stuff
just
like
to break up the grunge.
take this,
even
make
more.
a bit of a more saturated version. It's maybe
Because some parts of the grunge are darker than others. That's another option.
So we're getting a little gold in there.
Right. It's not. It's
And you can
we
just
don't need it
blend
to be
between
super
these
complicated. You can make it as
with,
complicated as you want.
Another
like this grunge
version
could
of that
be a
moisture
whole
noise
other
just
material,
rotated
just as
away or whatever.
complicated as our whole
We
graph.
get even
here.
more variety,
right? Or if you have a grunge you used on a different material that you like the look
it's
of,
very
you could
subtle.
also drag
But again,
that
you
in
can
as
make
its
this
own
as
material
complicated
and
or as
blend
simple
that
as you
over.
want. I'm okay with it being fairly subtle right now. I'm learning. I'm trying to learn to be okay with that. So I'll put this up here. And we're going to do this just to rearrange this a little bit. And we can call this section our like just kind of grunge or whatever. The other thing that the grunge should probably come quite late. But that's sort of it, just you want to think about the materials in like a physical way they're layered. Obviously the grunge should happen after anything that's like inherent to the stone itself. If we want to do some of these darker little splotches, there's some really easy ways to do that. So we could grab something like, I don't know, a dirt 2, maybe. We'll see how far this gets us. And you can histogram scan this just to get some little specks. And the simplest thing would be just to use a gradient dynamic or gradient map rather, to turn it into black and white and subtract it. Now we're going to make some adjustments to this because obviously it's not going to look great. Right? So you could do something like this just to add a bit of those speckly details. But I'm not crazy about this right now. First of all, I'm not crazy with how they're still a little big. So you could get more of them. And I think that's better. Their edges are also a little bit raggedy for me. Depends again on the style you're going for, right? This is just it depends on the project you're working on, or like, you know, what you're trying to build, I guess. But I'm going to blur these a little bit, so they're not so. I'm going to turn the intensity of this really high so we can see them. Yeah, like they're a little too raggedy for me. So I'm gonna turn this blur up even more, actually. I prefer this. These little spots. Maybe there's a happy medium. Yeah, something like that. So this works, but what's odd, right, is really these all look like they're the exact same color, which feels kind of bleh. It's okay. You can make it work for sure. But I think there's a lot more left on the table here. One thing you can do that's really fun is we can take a histogram scan of this, make sure it's like fully white, and we can do a flood fill, to position, right? So we have the position of all these little spots. And we can do that same thing we were doing with the pixel processor earlier. So we plug this in. That's going to be our position. And we're going to actually just sample the color itself. Like this. And we're going to do the same thing we did earlier. So we're going to get a float 2, which is our system variable for our position, and use that to sample our color input 0, which, as a reminder, is the positions of all these little specks. And then I'm going to use the X and Y coordinates of those positions to sample the color of input image 1, which, as a reminder, is our current base color. Make sure we set the image to input 1. And what you'll see is all of these specs are now sampling the color that's directly beneath them on the base color. Now, why do we care about this? If we use this instead, and we use our original dot as a mask, and we don't use subtract, use copy, we actually can't see them because they're the exact same color as the pixel that was underneath them. So this whole island is becoming this color because that's what was underneath it, and then getting blended over. So you might go, okay, well, who cares? But what's fun is if we move the sampled color, it doesn't really matter how much we move it, just move it a bit. Now those sample points, those little dots, are sampling a color that's from elsewhere on the texture. Right? So we get these spots all over the texture that are sampling colors from other parts of the texture. And if we want them to be more obvious, we could take like an HSL node even and bump up the saturation, like lower the darkness, or I guess raise the darkness. And we're going to get these specks all over the texture that have a lot more variety of color, and like because they're drawing from colors that are already there. I'll turn this up so it's really obvious. Right, so you can see here, we sampled some blues that are from somewhere else in the texture. And that just gives us this cool bit of variety here, where we're getting these little specks that are from elsewhere, essentially. I think it adds a really neat effect. You can even switch these to multiply if you want and pull them back. It just varies up those specs, so they're a little bit more interesting. They're not all the exact same color. essentially. Right, again, the intensity of this is really up to you to play with. I kind of actually might prefer them on copy on a higher intensity. Just lower the darkness a bit. Yeah, I think these are cool. I think that adds a lot. So they're not all exactly the same color, right? We get a variety of them. We can tone that down a bit. It's a little intense. But I think that's a nice little detail to add there. Another detail I think would be fun to put in here is these sort of really low opacity cracks we see here. I have an idea about how we're going to do this, but we may have to try a couple of things. But I think, and they're really subtle, but I do think they add a lot to the material, which I guess is true of almost everything we've been doing. But again, like a lot of good texturing is just subtle details loaded up over time, really. Happens a lot. So I'm going to take a tile sampler and we're just going to make a kind of slightly beveled square. Something like this. We're basically going to tile this guy around a bunch. So we're going to put them in here and we'll get a bunch of them. Like we'll get, I don't know, 64 by 64 or something. We may need more, but we'll do this for now. Set the pattern to image input, so we're using our actual pattern. And I think I'm going to actually make this square wider than it is tall. We may have to scale this up a bit. And to keep the size consistent piece to piece, we should have more of them in Y than we have in X. Sure, that's fine. And then scale, maybe I don't want them to be so different. Something like this. Sure. I'm going to make them not so different in X and Y. Sure, something like that. What we're going to do is start with the initial stuff, like put some position random on them. We'll definitely offset. Right, so they're like a little brick pattern. Put a tiny bit of position random. We want very little right now, at least at the beginning. We may need to add more later. I'm going to add some scale random here as well. And scale these up so they often touch. I'm also going to go to the color random and add a bit of color random. The big trick here is the rotation random. We're going to use the rotation map multipliers here. So how this works is if you put a gradient in here and turn the rotation map up, so you go down to rotation, the wider the value and the map, the more it's going to rotate. And the darker it is, the less it's going to rotate. You can see at the bottom, they barely rotated. And then the brighter it got, and the more they rotated until eventually they're like 180 degrees, like they're flipped. That's like halfway along the texture. And then eventually they rotate again until they're basically the same as they are at the top, really, because they've completed one full rotation. So this allows them to sort of rotate very similarly to the ones next to them. But we're going to use our tile mask, right? So our flood film mask. And we're going to bevel this and auto level it and use this instead. So the rotations sort of happen per tile. And I'm going to smooth these a bit too. So on the bevel, we'll turn the smoothing up to like 3. And we get this kind of flow. You'll see what I mean when we actually play with the slider. Where is our rotation random? Where did our thing go? There you go. So you can see how they kind of rotate mostly in the middle, not much at the end, and it creates this dependency, essentially. We might get even more of these. So let's go to like 80 by something like this. And I'm going to scale these up. We don't need as much of the rotation. We'll do like that. Scale them up a bit. And what I'm going to do is make a normal map of these. And we're not actually using the normal. We're using it to make a curvature smooth. And we're going to grab the convexity, and this is going to be our cell pattern, essentially. As you can see, we can kind of create this like cracked cell texture. Now we probably want smaller cells between them as well. And I think we should increase the scale random here to get some more variety. But this creates this kind of interesting crack pattern. We can scale these up more. Yeah. We could add a little bit of rotation random too if we want. As well, instead of just using purely this, which is fine, but let's blend in a bit of randomness as well. So I'm going to take a crystal. Like you can see what happens if we use a crystal instead of ours. Right? They kind of flow in this really janky. They flow together. Like the ones that are right next to the neighbors always rotate kind of similarly to how the ones beside them rotate. So instead of it all being totally random, they kind of rotate in this wave. This is really good for doing stuff like foliage. But we end up creating this kind of interesting crack pattern. And I think some combination of our two is what we're going to want. And I'll zoom the crystal out a bit. Yeah, I like the look of that. And we may want to duplicate this whole chain just to create much smaller ones as well. So these I'll have a lot more. And we'll do something similar. But this time I might grab a curvature Sobel and grab just the cracks. So this is another good way of doing it. And these are a bit smaller. But we're going to get the two combined. And that gives us, it's sort of like when we were creating our cracks on our stone earlier, really. And just some more variety. There might actually be too many of them, but we'll try. So let's turn the scale down on these a bit so that they connect more often. I just want them to connect a bit more frequently. And I think I'm going to turn that rotation random off. Cool. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this. Maybe want to try grabbing the curvature. Something like that. Yeah. Maybe we bevel this a little less, or let's add some more color random. Cool. So it's just playing with these. There's a lot of other ways of making cracks too. I just thought this would be a different way of doing it from what we did earlier. Maybe these are just too frequent. Probably have just too many of them. Something like that's better. I'll seed these. But this is just another way of doing it. And what I'll probably do at the end is Should we grab a curvature smooth instead of the Sobel? Let's just try it. I think this will add more variety. This probably a little too noisy. So I'll just go back to the Sobo filter. But this is fine. It just adds these little kind of hairline cracks. I'm almost wondering if I prefer it with just the one. Like without the small detail added. I think I'm actually going to turn the rotation random, the multiplier down a bit. Yeah, I kind of prefer that actually. I'm wondering if I even just prefer using just the crystal in general instead of using our tiles. I feel like this actually feels better. Yeah, I kind of like just the base one. The other thing you can, I think we're okay with just using the one layer. The other thing you could use is a vector map to rotate these. So if you were to create a normal map of this, do this. Instead of using our rotation map multiplier, use the vector map. And if we apply a 9-degree rotation, they'll sort of spiral per tile. Which I actually think is kind of cool as well. And we can even add a bit of both. So we can turn the rotation map, which is our black and white crystal. We can turn that up a little as well, just to break it up. I think this actually works really nice. I like this better. So they kind of spiral into the center of their tiles as a rule, but then there's a bit of randomness to them, which feels a lot more like what our reference looks like. And we can always, you know, combine these. Like I said, if we wanted to add more, of the rotation multiplier, we can turn that up. But I think this feels nice just for those base cracks. And really, this is just going to get added on, I feel, because they just become white. So I'll just literally add this. They're a little big. And we're not going to want them on every tile equally strong, but let's just see what this looks like. Yeah, I don't hate that, but I think we just need way more of them. So they're smaller. So we'll go up to like 100 and... Yeah, I think that works. Be interested to see a curvature so build, just so that they're a bit tighter. A lot of this is just experimentation, just trying to find the right... Like, I think this is good. It's going to be too obvious they're cells. Although we could vector warp them. Like, there's options here. The other thing you can do is high pass filter this. So it's a bit closer. And then scan it. Yeah, I like that. I think that's kind of cool. Yeah, I don't mind that. Let's do that instead. So it's nice with this one, you see me just sort of experiment. I didn't know exactly I was going to do it, but I had like an idea. And I think this works fairly well. It's kind of cool. And it might actually be worth duplicating this layer now and having a finer one. Now this is feeling a bit better. So maybe we just duplicate this chain. Let's take all this, duplicate it. Move this over here. We can reuse this. Or we don't need to make a whole new brick. They're exactly the same. Same thing with these. Right, we don't need to reuse this stuff. We only need one of this. But this one, I'm just going to make way more of them. Like way more. And this is hopefully to get some just finer. We probably need way more. And the idea is to just blend these together. And I might actually even I want to use skip the high pass for this one. What we're gonna do too, I'm gonna rotate these ones so that they're 90 degrees to the other cracks. So if I go to here, I'm just gonna apply a straight up 90-degree rotation. Yeah, okay, I think that works well. You can see the difference. And I do think I want to do a Sobel here so that they're tighter. I think this will work better. If we can just grab a really thin line between them. Like that, yeah. There you go. I think that's cool. I feel like a shatter now. And I think we still want even fewer of them. Or more of them, I guess, which makes the lines thinner. Yeah. There we go. Just play with the total amount of them. Cool. Yeah, I think that works really well. So there's some things we can do here to vary this up because obviously it's a little too obvious and present on all of them. So what we're going to do, we'll take this. We're going to grab a dot, grab our flood fill, grab a flood fill to B-box size. Or not B-box size, I keep doing that. We're going to do flood fill to mapper grayscale. That's a color, flood fill to mapper grayscale. And we're going to plug our crack pattern in. We're going to really scale these down. Sorry, scale them up a ton so that they're huge. But now we can give a scale random. So on some tiles, the cracks are finer than on other ones. Right, so it's subtle, but it just means they're not going to be the exact same scale of crack on every tile. And I can like turn the global scale down. So they're bigger just generally. But here, we'll do this so you can really tell. Right, on some tiles, the cracks are a lot finer than others right now. This is obviously extreme. We don't want to go that much. But some difference is good. We can also add rotations here. I'm going to turn that auto scale off. But that adds a bit more variety. And these nodes are really cheap. Most of the flood fills are cheap. But I think this works great. Adds a lot of variety. You can see this is getting a little blurred. It's not the end of the world. We can scan it. So if you want, what we can do here is just threshold this. So it's pure white. Or at the very least, scan it. I don't like that the threshold's making them so thick. So adding a bit of position, full threshold, or full contrast rather, this won't make them as thick. There we go. I think that's exactly what we want. I like that. That's cool. And looking at the reference, it's not as visible on every tile. And even within one tile, there's lots of areas where they aren't as visible either. So learning all we've learned, right? Or talking about all we've learned, that's fairly easy to do, right? That's not that complicated. So I'm going to take this and we already have our flood fill up here, which is great because we can do a flood fill to random grayscale rather. And this is just, I'm sure people, if you've been watching since the beginning, and again, bless your heart, what we can do here is just control how strong it is per tile, right? We can even turn it off on some if we want. Right, we've been doing this a lot. Right, so this will turn it off on a lot of them and make them weaker on a bunch. Right, so those cracks aren't present on every tile. And on some they're really strong, on some they're really weak. Which I think also looks really nice. And if we want to blend them out on certain tiles in certain places, I'm just turning the intensity up so we can see the variety better. It's not uncommon for me to turn the strength of an effect way up just so I can see what I'm doing, right? And then I'll come back and tune those down. So if you want it to be less strong in other places or certain places, you can grab like a cloud and take a like histogram of this. Like something like this. And we could just multiply it over top this. We're basically just creating a little mask here that was going to modulate how strong the cracks are in different places, which is nice. So now even within one tile, it's not going to be the same intensity everywhere, which works really well. Right, and that's fairly similar to what we have here. We kind of have these blurry shapes that mask it out, and that's exactly what we're doing here. A ton of what you're doing in Designer is just identifying the shape here. Like the cloud gets a little weaker, or the cracks get a little weaker here, and it's sort of this blobby, irregular blend, really, right? So I should be really free to just imitate that shape on these. That works well. I think I'm going to turn them on a few more cracks. Just so they're the cracks are a bit more present. Like they're on, I've turned them off on less. And then we just play with the strength of these. I also think this is probably a little too strong, the turning them on and off. There you go. I like that. And then we just turn the opacity down a bit. So I think that's really effective. Right? It's all about just layering that detail on slowly, one bit at a time. I think the tiles themselves need a bit. I'm just noticing as we're getting closer to these, just some more kind of just general grunge and breakup. It's nothing like really specific. So before I lay on all of our finishers here, and actually think our grunge should happen after the cracks, probably. So we should rearrange the order those happen in. The grunge really should happen like basically last. So very easy to just restructure these. Right, this guy needs to go down here. We just plug this in here. This one goes in here. Just changing the order so that the grunge happens on top of the... Well, this wasn't the grunge. This is our spots. But I like the spots actually happening after anyway, too, because they might be able to grab some of the white of the scratches, which is nice, too. So I think that was actually... that's actually worth reordering that anyway. It creates more variety for our little dots. And then over here, I'm just going to add to our base color here another just generic grunge. And we'll take a moisture. I really like moisture noises for rocks. Or things that are just generally made out of stone. It tends to do a good job. And I'm just going to add some of this. I just want to see what it looks like when we add just a bit of just general grunge. Might be a little intense. So I'm going to zoom this out. And it's a little intense still. So what I might actually do here is do something like take a high pass. This just gets rid of a bunch of the low frequencies. Auto level it, use him instead. And then use the original moisture noise as a mask. Right, so you can see it on full strength. I'm just modeling it a bit more. Like creating some additional color variation. Is obviously really strong, right? So we're going to tone this down quite a bit. But it's just, we just want to feel it, not really see it. And I think that is really good for the tile albedo for now. We will likely come back and do a slight bit of touch up on this later. Put this over here. Let's just reorganize this slightly. Right, so here's our cracks and stuff. Here's our grunge and all of our finishers. So we'll call, oh, we want to make sure we use the same color as the other frames. Cracks and dents. So I think this is super solid. What we want to do now is actually work on our patterns. And I think we're going to go with one of these two. So we're going to have to play with these a bit.